At 10:25 hours on May 27, 1941, Captain Benjamin Martin stood on the bridge of HMS Dorsetshire watching the German battleship Bismarck burn 8 miles ahead through the morning haze. For 36 hours, British forces had been hunting this ship across 1,750 miles of Atlantic Ocean. Now she was crippled, surrounded and dying under the guns of battleships King George V and Rodney. But Bismarck would not sink. Dorsetshire was a county-class heavy cruiser 630 feet long, displacing 925 tons. Standard. She carried 8 8-inch Mark VIII guns in 4 twin turrets, 8 4-inch anti-aircraft guns, and 8 21-inch torpedo tubes mounted in 2 quadruple launchers amidships. She had served in the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the South Atlantic. She had escorted convoys, hunted commerce raiders, and supported amphibious operations. But she had never torpedoed a battleship. Captain Martin received the order from Admiral John Tovey aboard King George V at 10:15 hours. The message was direct. Close to torpedo range, finish Bismarck. King George V and Rodney were running low on fuel and ammunition after pounding the German battleship for over an hour. They needed to withdraw before German submarines or aircraft arrived. Dorsetshire would deliver the final blow. Martin ordered flank speed. Dorsetshire's 4 Parsons geared turbines generating 80,000 shaft horsepower drove her forward at 32 knots. The cruiser heeled into a sharp turn bow, cutting through the Atlantic swells as she closed the distance to the burning German ship. What Martin could see through his binoculars was the wreckage of what had been the most powerful battleship in the German Navy. Bismarck was dead in the water, listing heavily to port, her superstructure shattered by British shells fires raging from stem to stern. Her forward turrets were silent barrels pointed at random angles. Her aft turrets still fired occasionally, but the shooting was wild, uncontrolled. The battleship that had sunk HMS Hood 3 days earlier with a single salvo was now a floating wreck. But she was still afloat, and that was the problem. The hunt for Bismarck had begun 108 hours earlier, on May 23, when British cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk spotted her in the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland. Bismarck was not alone. She was accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, both ships attempting to break into the Atlantic shipping lanes to attack British convoys. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, commanding the battle cruiser HMS Hood and the new battleship HMS Prince of Wales, intercepted the German force at dawn on May 24. The engagement lasted 20 minutes. Bismarck's 5th salvo struck Hood's aft magazines. The battle cruiser exploded and sank in 3 minutes. 15 men died. Only 3 survived. Prince of Wales, hit 7 times, was forced to break off. But she had scored 3 hits on Bismarck. 2 were insignificant, causing minor damage to the superstructure. The 3rd shell, a 14-inch armor-piercing round, struck Bismarck's port bow, penetrating 2 oil tanks and flooding a 3rd. The hit was not critical to the ship's combat capability, but it created 2 serious problems. First, Bismarck lost approximately 1,000 tons of fuel oil contaminated by seawater, now unusable. Second, the flooding in the forward compartments caused a bow-down trim that increased water resistance and reduced maximum speed from 30 knots to 28 knots. Fleet Admiral G.A. Honofo Lenny 14 Gens, commanding the operation from Bismarck's bridge, faced an immediate decision. Continue the mission with reduced fuel and speed or abort and return to occupied France for repairs. Gens chose to abort. He detached Prince Eugen to continue commerce raiding independently and turned Bismarck southeast toward Saint-Nazaire, the only Atlantic port with a dry dock large enough to accommodate her. The British Admiralty, learning of Hood's destruction, mobilized every available warship to hunt Bismarck. Admiral John Tovey, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, commanded the operation from his flagship, King George V. The force included King George V Rodney, the battlecruiser, Renown the aircraft carrier, Victorious, the aircraft carrier, Ark Royal, multiple cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. But the Atlantic Ocean is vast. Finding one battleship in 41 million square miles of water required precise intelligence and relentless pursuit. For 31 hours from the evening of May 24th through the night of May 25th, British forces lost contact with Bismarck. Shadowing cruisers lost her in a rain squall. Radar contact faded, search aircraft found nothing but empty ocean. LO-1 Torpedoes believed he had escaped. He transmitted multiple radio messages to German headquarters reporting Hood's destruction, requesting U-boat support and providing his position and course. The transmissions were a catastrophic mistake. British direction-finding stations triangulated the signals. Analysts plotted Bismarck's position and calculated her course. She was heading for France. At 10:30 hours on May 26, a Catalina flying boat from RAF Coastal Command spotted Bismarck 690 miles west of Brest. The battleship was approximately 24 hours from reaching the protection of German air cover based in occupied France. Once under that umbrella, British surface ships could not attack without facing overwhelming Luftwaffe response. Tovey's force was too far behind to intercept before Bismarck reached French waters. King George V was 135 miles northwest Rodney, 125 miles northeast, but both battleships could only make 22-23 knots in the heavy seas. They would never catch a ship capable of 28 knots before she reached safety. The only British force close enough to intercept was Force H from Gibraltar, commanded by Vice Admiral James Somerville. Force H included the battlecruiser, Renown the aircraft carrier, Ark Royal, and the cruiser Sheffield. But Renown could not engage Bismarck alone. The battlecruiser's 15-inch guns could penetrate Bismarck's armor at certain ranges, but Bismarck's 15-inch guns and superior armor protection gave her a decisive advantage in a one-on-one engagement. The only way to stop Bismarck was to slow her down. That mission fell to Ark Royal's Swordfish torpedo bombers, 15 Fairey Swordfish obsolete biplanes with a maximum speed of 138 miles per hour, launched at 14:50 hours on May 20th. They attacked through heavy anti-aircraft fire from Bismarck's gunners, who had been continuously at action stations for 3 days. The first attack failed. Several aircraft mistakenly attacked HMS Sheffield, which was shadowing Bismarck. No hits were scored on Sheffield, but the error forced the aircraft to return to Ark Royal rearm with different torpedoes and launch a second strike. 15 Swordfish launched again at 19:10 hours. They attacked at dusk in deteriorating weather waves, 30 feet high visibility, less than 2 miles. Bismarck maneuvered violently, her captain Ernst Lindemann throwing the massive battleship into emergency turns to avoid the slow-moving torpedoes. 13 torpedoes missed, 2 hit. 1 struck amidships on the armored belt and caused negligible damage. The second torpedo hit Bismarck's stern at 2055 hours, striking just aft of the port rudder. The explosion jammed Bismarck's rudders 15 degrees to port. Damage control teams attempted emergency repairs throughout the night. They could not access the steering compartments, which were flooded and under pressure. They attempted to steer using the propellers alone, varying speed on the port and starboard shafts to control direction. It did not work. Bismarck could only steam in a wide circle to port. At 23:40 hours, LO-1 Fortunes transmitted a final message to German headquarters. Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the FO-1 Fabor. Bismarck's crew worked through the night to free the jammed rudders or rig emergency steering gear. Divers attempted to cut away the damaged rudder using explosives. The sea state made the work impossible. Engineers proposed welding the rudders amidships to allow straight-line steaming. There was no time and no equipment capable of performing the work in these conditions. By dawn on May 27, Bismarck had been steaming in circles for 8 hours. She had traveled less than 40 miles from where the torpedo hit. King George V and Rodney were closing from the northwest. Tovey had positioned his battleships to intercept at first light. At 08:47 hours, Rodney's forward 16-inch turret opened fire at 23,400 yards. King George V fired her first salvo 3 minutes later. The final battle had begun. For the next hour and 5 minutes, British battleships systematically destroyed Bismarck at ranges between 12,000 and 16,000 yards. The German battleship's fire control systems were damaged early in the engagement. Her optical rangefinders were smashed by shell splinters. Her forward fire control director was hit and destroyed. Her gunners fired by local control, aiming at muzzle flashes, hitting nothing. Rodney's 16-inch shells punched through Bismarck's armor like paper. King George V's 14-inch shells ripped into her superstructure. Norfolk and Dorsetshire, approaching from the south, added their 8-inch guns to the bombardment. By 1,000 hours, Bismarck was a burning wreck. Her main armament silenced, her superstructure collapse fires raging throughout the ship. But she was still afloat. Her hull integrity remained largely intact. Her armor belt, 12.6 inches thick, had deflected or absorbed hundreds of shell hits. Her internal compartmentalization prevented catastrophic flooding. The ship was destroyed as a fighting unit, but she was not sinking. Tovey observed this with growing concern. King George V had expended 339 rounds of 14-inch ammunition. Rodney had fired 380 rounds of 16-inch and 716 rounds of 6-inch. Both battleships were running low on fuel, having steamed at high speed for 2 days. German submarines were known to be in the area. Luftwaffe bombers from France could arrive within hours. The battleships could not remain on station much longer. But Bismarck had to be sunk. If she remained afloat, German tugs might attempt to tow. U-boats might provide escort. Even a drifting hulk represented a propaganda victory for Germany. At 10:15 hours, Tovey ordered Dorsetshire to close and torpedo the crippled battleship. The cruiser was fresh, having joined the battle only 30 minutes earlier. Her torpedo armament was intact. Her crew was rested. Captain Martin acknowledged the order and brought Dorsetshire around to approach Bismarck's starboard side. The heavy cruiser closed to 3,300 yards well, within effective torpedo range. At this distance, Martin could see Bismarck clearly through his binoculars. The battleship was listing approximately 20 degrees to port. Her entire superstructure was wrecked twisted metal, and fires visible throughout. Her main turrets were silent barrels trained at random angles, some pointed skyward, where they had frozen when hydraulic systems failed. Men were visible on Bismarck's decks. Some were fighting fires with portable equipment. Others were standing motionless, watching the British cruiser approach. A few were jumping overboard, preferring the cold Atlantic to the burning ship. At 10:25 hours, Martin gave the order to fire torpedoes. Dorsetshire's starboard torpedo mounted a quadruple 21-inch launcher trained toward Bismarck. The torpedoes were Mark 9 models, each carrying a 750-pound Torpex warhead set to run at 35 knots to a depth of 12 feet. The launcher fired. 4 torpedoes entered the water in rapid succession, their compressed air propulsion systems leaving visible trails of bubbles. Running time to target was approximately 90 seconds. The torpedoes ran straight and true, 3 of the 4 striking Bismarck on her starboard side, amidships. The explosions were clearly visible columns of water and smoke erupting from Bismarck's hull. The battleship shuddered from the impacts, her list increasing noticeably. Flooding began in the torpedo-damaged compartments, but Bismarck's internal subdivision limited the immediate effect. She was already so heavily damaged that 3 more torpedo hits barely changed her condition. Martin brought Dorsetshire around to Bismarck's port side. If the starboard torpedoes had not been sufficient, he would ensure the battleship sank by attacking from the opposite side, flooding compartments on both sides of the ship to guarantee she would capsize. Dorsetshire closed to 2,500 yards on Bismarck's port beam. At 10:36 hours, the port torpedo mount fired a single torpedo. It struck Bismarck on her port side forward of the amidships section. The explosion added more flooding to compartments already devastated by British shell fire. Bismarck's list increased to 30 degrees. The battleship was clearly dying, now settling lower in the water, listing further with each minute. Men were abandoning ship in increasing numbers, jumping from the main deck, sliding down the angled hull into the water. Hundreds of sailors were in the water wearing life jackets, calling for help, swimming away from the ship. Captain Martin faced an immediate decision. Dorsetshire could remain on station to rescue survivors, or she could withdraw to a safer distance. Intelligence reports indicated U-boats were converging on the area. Remaining stationary while picking up survivors would make Dorsetshire a perfect target for torpedo attack. Martin decided to begin rescue operations immediately. He ordered Dorsetshire to approach the survivors, slow to a stop and lower cargo nets and lines over the side. Sailors stationed along the rails called to German sailors in the water, directing them to the nets, throwing life rings to those too weak to swim. The rescue began at 10:40 hours. Dorsetshire's crew pulled exhausted German sailors from the water. Many were injured, burned, or suffering from hypothermia. The water temperature was 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Survival time without immersion suits was approximately 1 hour before hypothermia caused loss of consciousness. At 10:58 hours, Bismarck capsized. Her list passed 45 degrees, then 60 degrees, then 90 degrees. She rolled completely over, floating upside down for several seconds, her bottom hull exposed, red anti-fouling paint visible. Then her bow rose into the air, the massive ship standing nearly vertical before sliding stern first beneath the surface. The time was 10:59 hours. Bismarck had sunk in 15,700 feet of water at position 48.10 N, 16.12 UW, approximately 400 miles west of Brest, France. Of her crew of 2,221 men, fewer than 400 were in the water. The rest had gone down with the ship, killed by British shellfire, trapped in flooded compartments, or choosing to remain aboard. Dorsetshire continued rescue operations. The cruiser had pulled 85 German sailors from the water when at 11:10 hours her lookouts reported a periscope contact on 500 yards to starboard. The submarine report was probably false, likely a piece of debris or an optical illusion created by waves. But Captain Martin could not take the risk. He ordered emergency full speed and immediate withdrawal. Dorsetshire accelerated away from the survivors, leaving approximately 300 German sailors in the water, still alive, calling for rescue. Martin had no choice. His orders required him to protect his ship and crew. Remaining on station while a U-boat stalked his ship would be criminal negligence. The German destroyer Z-23 and the weather ship Saxonwald would later rescue 5 additional survivors. In total, 110 men from Bismarck's crew of 2,221 survived. The loss of life was catastrophic. Had 11 dead, more than the entire crew of HMS Hood, which had lost 415 men 3 days earlier. The destruction of Bismarck ended Germany's attempt to use surface ships against Atlantic convoys. The Kriegsmarine had lost its newest battleship, the pride of the German fleet, along with most of her crew. The loss was irreplaceable. Germany had no comparable ship under construction. The remaining German surface fleet, Tirpitz, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, would be used more cautiously, restricted to Norwegian waters, or kept in port as a fleet in being to tie down British resources. But Dorsetshire's role in the battle was not finished. The cruiser had fired the torpedoes that ensured Bismarck's destruction, but her survival was now in question. The rescue had consumed 30 minutes' time, during which Dorsetshire remained stationary or slow-moving in waters where U-boats were hunting. Her crew was exhausted from action stations, her fuel state was adequate but not comfortable, and her position was known to German intelligence. Captain Martin set course for the United Kingdom at maximum sustained speed. Dorsetshire would zigzag, continuously varying course every few minutes to frustrate submarine attacks. Her lookouts would maintain constant watch for periscopes, torpedo wakes, or surfaced U-boats. Her sonar operators would listen continuously for propeller sounds indicating submarines. The transit to the United Kingdom took 2 days. Dorsetshire arrived at a British port on May 29, 1941, delivered her 85 German prisoners to military authorities, and prepared for her next assignment. The crew was granted limited shore leave, the ship was refueled, reprovisioned, and made ready for sea. For Captain Martin and his officers, the destruction of Bismarck was the most significant action they would participate in during the early war years. Dorsetshire had delivered the killing blow to the German battleship, the torpedoes that finally sent her to the bottom after British battleships had battered her into a floating wreck. The question that would haunt historians for decades was whether the torpedoes were necessary. Post-war analysis suggested Bismarck was already sinking when Dorsetshire torpedoed her. German survivors interviewed after the war reported that scuttling charges had been set and fired before the ship capsized. The crew had opened seacocks to flood the ship and ensure she sank before British forces could board and capture her. British analysts disputed this claim. They argued that the scuttling charges, if fired, had minimal effect compared to the damage from British shells and torpedoes. Bismarck's armor belt remained largely intact throughout the battle. Shell damage was concentrated on her superstructure and upper decks. The hull, below the waterline, was penetrated in relatively few places by British gunfire. The torpedoes from Dorsetshire struck below the armor belt, opening large holes in the hull that flooded internal compartments. These hits, combined with earlier damage, ensured the ship would sink within minutes rather than hours. Without the torpedo hits, Bismarck might have remained afloat for an extended period, possibly long enough for German tugs to reach her. The debate became academic in 1989 when oceanographer Robert Ballard located Bismarck's wreck on the seafloor. His expedition used deep-sea submersibles to examine the hull in detail. The findings were significant and controversial. Ballard's team discovered that Bismarck's hull was largely intact. The ship had not been torn apart by internal explosions, as would be expected if magazines detonated. Instead, she had capsized and sank relatively intact, settling upright on the seafloor. The hull showed extensive shell damage to the superstructure but relatively few penetrations below the waterline. More importantly, the team found that the ship's bottom hull had separated from the rest of the structure. This separation occurred as the ship sank when internal compartments imploded from water pressure. It was not evidence of scuttling charges or torpedo damage, but rather the natural result of a ship sinking to great depth. Ballard concluded that Bismarck sank primarily due to scuttling by her crew, not British action. This conclusion was based on the lack of catastrophic damage to the hull, the absence of magazine explosions, and German survivor testimony about scuttling charges being fired. British naval historians disputed Ballard's conclusions. They argued that scuttling charges and open seacocks merely accelerated a sinking that was already inevitable. Bismarck had been rendered incapable of navigation. Her rudders jammed, her engines damaged, her crew decimated by shell fire. She was a floating wreck that would have sunk eventually, whether scuttled or not. The torpedoes from Dorsetshire ensured she sank within minutes rather than hours. They removed any possibility of salvage or towing. They guaranteed that Bismarck would not remain afloat as a propaganda symbol or a potential threat if somehow recovered by German forces. From a tactical standpoint, Dorsetshire's torpedo attack was absolutely necessary. Admiral Tovey could not allow Bismarck to remain afloat, could not wait hours or days for flooding to naturally sink the ship, could not risk U-boat attacks or Luftwaffe intervention, while British battleships stood by waiting for Bismarck to go down. The torpedoes were the correct tactical decision. They ensured mission accomplishment, eliminated uncertainty, and allowed British forces to withdraw before German reinforcements arrived. Whether those torpedoes were the primary cause of Bismarck's sinking or merely accelerated a sinking already in progress was militarily irrelevant. Dorsetshire's career continued for exactly one more year. After sinking Bismarck, the heavy cruiser returned to convoy escort duties, patrolled the Denmark Strait and Iceland-Faroe Gap, hunting for German commerce raiders, and participated in operations supporting British forces in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. On April 5, 1942, Dorsetshire was operating in the Indian Ocean as part of the Eastern Fleet under Admiral James Somerville. Japanese forces had entered the Indian Ocean with a carrier task force including the fleet carriers Akagi Hiryu, Soryu Shokaku, and Zuikaku, the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 4 months earlier. Somerville's intelligence suggested Japanese carriers would attack Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, on April 5th. He positioned his fleet to intercept, but the intelligence was incomplete. Japanese carriers had divided into two groups. One group attacked Colombo Harbor as expected. The second group hunted for British surface ships. Dorsetshire and her sister ship Cornwall had been detached from the main fleet for refueling at Colombo. After completing replenishment, both cruisers were transiting south to rejoin the fleet when Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted them at 1600 hours on April 5th. At 1350 hours on April 5th, 1942-53, Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers from the carriers Akagi Hiryu and Soryu attacked Dorsetshire and Cornwall. The cruisers had no air cover, no friendly fighters, no support. They were alone, 200 miles from the nearest British base. The attack lasted 8 minutes. Cornwall was hit first, taking 9 bombs that caused catastrophic flooding and fires. She capsized and sank at 1400 hours. Dorsetshire maneuvered violently, her captain attempting to avoid the diving aircraft. The cruiser was hit by at least 10 bombs, possibly more. Explosions ripped through her hull, starting uncontrollable fires, flooding engine rooms, destroying electrical systems. At 14:05 hours, the order was given to abandon ship. Dorsetshire capsized and sank at 14:15 hours, 10 minutes after the attack began. Of her crew of 712 men, approximately 500 initially survived and entered the water. The destroyers Paladin and Panther arrived 6 hours later and rescued 122 survivors from both cruisers combined. 424 men from Dorsetshire survived. 288 died. Captain Augustus Agar, captain of Dorsetshire, survived. He was rescued by Paladin and subsequently court-martialed for the loss of his ship, a standard procedure after any ship loss. The court-martial concluded that the attack was unavoidable, the ship was properly handled, and no blame attached to the captain or crew. Agar was acquitted and returned to duty. The cruiser that sank Bismarck was herself sunk by Japanese aircraft 1 year and 11 days after her most famous action. She had survived 3 years of war in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, only to be destroyed in 8 minutes by carrier aircraft in the Indian Ocean. The symmetry was cruel. Bismarck had been sunk by aircraft from Ark Royal, crippling her steering, followed by surface ships, finishing her off. Dorsetshire was sunk by aircraft from Japanese carriers with no surface ships involved. Naval warfare had evolved. The age of the battleship was ending. The age of carrier aviation was beginning. HMS Dorsetshire received battle honors for her service. Bismarck, 1941, Indian Ocean, 1941 to 1942. She is remembered primarily for her role in the final destruction of the German battleship, the torpedoes that sent the pride of the Kriegsmarine to the bottom of the Atlantic. The torpedoes were fired at 10:25 and 10:36 hours on May 27, 1941. 7 torpedoes launched, 4 hits confirmed. The Bismarck sank at 10:59 hours 23 minutes after the final torpedo struck. Whether those torpedoes were the decisive factor in her sinking or merely hastened an inevitable end remains debated. What is not debated is that Dorsetshire accomplished her mission. She ensured Bismarck would not survive, would not be towed to safety, would not become a symbol of German naval power. The German battleship went to the bottom, and the Atlantic convoy routes remained open to British shipping. Captain Benjamin Martin made the correct tactical decision when he ordered rescue operations suspended and Dorsetshire withdrawn at maximum speed. He saved his ship and crew from potential submarine attack. He preserved a valuable heavy cruiser for continued service. The 300 German sailors left in the water were enemy combatants from a ship that had just sunk a British battlecruiser and killed 115 British sailors. The decision was militarily sound. It was also the decision that haunted Martin for the rest of his life. In interviews after the war, he expressed regret that more survivors could not be rescued, but he never questioned whether withdrawing was the correct decision under the circumstances. HMS Dorsetshire's wreck was discovered in 2007 by a team of underwater researchers. She lies in approximately 1,500 meters of water, approximately 200 miles southwest of Sri Lanka. The wreck is designated a war grave protected by international maritime law. Salvage is prohibited. The ship that delivered the final blow to Bismarck rests on the ocean floor, 4,500 miles from where she sent the German battleship to the bottom. Both ships are war graves, both protected, both remembered for their roles in naval battles that defined the early years of World War II. The torpedoes fired by Dorsetshire on May 27, 1941 were not the most powerful weapons fired that day. Rodney's 16-inch guns and King George V's 14-inch guns had done far more damage to Bismarck's structure. But the torpedoes were the final blow, the weapon that ensured the German battleship would sink within minutes, the attack that closed the hunt for Bismarck and ended Germany's last serious attempt to threaten Atlantic convoys with surface raiders. That was Dorsetshire's contribution to the war. Not the most dramatic, not the most celebrated, but absolutely essential. The cruiser that finished Bismarck, that made certain the German battleship would never threaten another convoy, never sink another British warship, never return to Germany, as a symbol of naval superiority. 4 torpedoes, 3 hits, 23 minutes to sinking. The final fatal torpedo shot that sent Bismarck to the bottom and ended the most intensive naval hunt of the Second World War.